Lecture 45, Lope de Vega.
Our fourth lecture on drama will focus on the Spanish dramatist Lope de Vega. You'll recall that in our lecture on Marlowe, we congratulated Marlowe for the great achievement of writing 7 plays before his untimely death at the age of 29. We called Shakespeare prolific, and I think rightly so, for writing 38 plays. So, what are we to make of the subject of today's lecture? The Spanish Golden Age playwright Lope de Vega, rough contemporary of Shakespeare and Marlowe. In fact, he was born 2 years earlier in 1562, Shakespeare and Marlowe born in 1564, and he outlives Shakespeare by almost 20 years, dying in 1635. An early biographer claims that Lope wrote 1,800 plays. Rather more modestly, Lope himself put the number at a mere 1,500. And whatever we think of those numbers, we have surviving texts for 450 of them. He was not only prolific, but he was prolific almost beyond imagining, but he was prolific and good. A Spanish expression for top-of-the-line stuff is es de Lope, that is to say, it's by Lope, his name itself being enough to signify superlative value. Lope was, by all accounts, as prolific in life as he was in art. He, I don't think, matched love affairs and plays on a one-to-one basis, but he came pretty close, and in fact had a great many. His career as a lover seems to be only slightly curtailed, slightly slowed down in 1614 when, after the death of his wife and a child, he was ordained a priest. He seems to have taken his vow of celibacy more as a kind of suggestion than as an absolute. This wonderfully R-rated life would in fact be worth going on in more detail about if we had time to treat his poetry, because it seems to be the case that he celebrates these love affairs fairly directly in his poetry. It's nonetheless worth mentioning because I think he seems to embody in some way or another his life experiences in all of his written work, drama as well as poetry. Cervantes called him a monstrosity of nature. Don't think he meant it as a compliment. What he meant, I think, was not only that he was extraordinarily prolific in his output, but I think that there's this sense about Lope that Cervantes is getting at here, that the source of his work was nature in the sense of life experiences rather than more studied in terms of studying the craft of his art. It seems to me that this is not a bad way, perhaps a very useful way, in fact, to think about Lope, because it seems to me that he looked at his own life from a kind of dramatic point of view. He sort of saw his life, conceived of it as a kind of drama. And it seems to me that it wouldn't be such a bad idea to turn that around and see that he conceives of drama from the point of view of an imitation of life fairly directly. We talked in the lecture on Marlowe in particular, and applied a little bit in the lectures on Shakespeare, that there was a fairly distinguished dramatic tradition in the English Middle Ages, which folks like Marlowe and Shakespeare and their contemporaries were able to draw on rather energetically. Spain did not have the same kind of depth of dramatic tradition in the Middle Ages as England did. And what it means is that the later development of drama there meant that dramatists had to in some way help create and educate their own audiences, that they were not necessarily already there with a long tradition of theater going. And in order to help bring this about, Lope himself writes a treatise sort of talking about the situation called The New Art of Writing Comedies at This Time. This time actually turns out to be 1609 when the treatise came out. I think it's worth taking a look at this treatise as a way into both the Spanish theater more generally and Lope's own works in particular. First of all, it's important to see that what he was doing was entering into an argument that was more or less European-wide about what the proper prescriptions for dramatic art were. That there were theoretic treatises on this question sort of going around in the Renaissance, and in particular, starting out in Italy. There was a set of new rules, or a set of rules that developed in Italy during this time that essentially considered itself to be a set of footnotes to what Aristotle had famously written in the Poetics. Aristotle looks back at what the great Greek dramatists have done in the Poetics, sort of talks about what they were up to, so to speak, and in an inductive way talks about what works and what doesn't work, or what has worked and what doesn't work as well. And the sense that he was moving from the experience of his own day to generalizations about what constitutes good drama was taken far further in the Italian theorists who were basing their own work on Aristotle, because what these theorists did was more or less took Aristotle and froze him into a kind of orthodoxy. A play must be along the following lines. Well, what lines were they? First of all, very important non-bridgeable distinction between comedy and tragedy. Separate, not interchangeable genres. Second, a play must have a 5-act structure. What about tragedies? What are they all about? Well, they included the fall of a hero from a very high position, which means, of course, that the heroes had to be in a very high position in the first place. A man, or a woman for that matter, in Greek tragedy, Medea comes famously to mind, is going to fall from a high place. And this fall is going to come about because of what is often called a tragic flaw, something inherent in his or her own character. And yet, at the same time, tragedy is going to bring in the question of fate, so that fate plays a great part of this as well. Emotions of pity and fear are going to be aroused and purged in the spectator by watching carefully at such a dramatic spectacle. And I might add that this has a kind of long life, that this was not simply Renaissance theoreticians talking to each other. It still has its place nowadays, I think, in the high school classroom. When I teach my own Shakespeare course, for example, I come and ask them at the beginning, what do they know about tragedy? What's it supposed to be? What they give me is almost a kind of annotated list that comes from this tradition, especially the sense of fall from high place based on a kind of inner tragic flaw. I point out to them that very often this seems not to apply as well to the Shakespeare plays that we look at as they think it is going to. But in any case, that's for tragedy. When they talked about comedy, they said, well, what you're going to have here are middle-class folks rather than people at the upper level of society. And the middle-class concern is going to be love and marriage. And marriage is going to be all about overcoming obstacles put in the way by some sort of establishment type, usually the father. Again, we mentioned this a bit when we talked about The Merchant of Venice in the first lecture on Shakespeare. And love is going to find a way to overcome all of these obstacles. Well, for these Italian Renaissance theorists, one of the things that's very interesting is the way everything was sort of put in place and you couldn't really deviate from it. But another thing that was kind of interesting is that when they looked for examples, they tended not to go all the way back to the Greeks, but to allow themselves to see their Roman, their Latin predecessors as the ones who had sort of established the practical examples, so that the great tragedian for these Italian Renaissance theorists turns out to be Seneca, whose rather bookish tragedies were their model. Not entirely clear that Seneca was always acted out. He may well have been more somebody that you would read than somebody that you would put on. And Terence for comedy. Well, all of this was there as a kind of unassailable theoretical justification for drama, and Lope comes along and looks at all of this and says, no, pretty emphatically. He asks not what the ancients did or what some moderns think that the ancients did, but his question is, what's going to work? Work meaning, what's going to get people into the theater the first time around, and what's going to keep them coming back? So he sees a need to educate his audience as well as to please them. And he says, what's going to work for the folks that I'm dealing with? Comedies, he says, are going to have a better chance of pleasing their audience. And it turns out that he called all of his plays comedias. The word itself in the Spanish vocabulary becomes synonymous with play rather than play with happy ending. Regardless of whether they had tragic outcomes, upper class or lower class folks for their heroes, they were called comedias. Lope says, this is kind of cool, I haven't read the theory, a lie, he had, but he says, I haven't read the theory, all I am is a successful dramatist. And then going even farther, he says, I have a good idea, let's lock up Aristotle. So that's Lope on the theater. Lope says also, 3 acts are better than 5. It's implied that the reason for this, it's never stated in the treatise, but the reason for this is that 3 acts are shorter than 5. That what Lope essentially saw was, you're not going to keep these people happy if you go over 2 hours. So how long? 2 hours? 2 hours is 3 acts, and 2 hours is something like 3,000 lines of verse in his play. He says, let's ignore some of the other things that are supposedly part of this Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle seems to be saying, or at least was interpreted as saying, that there should be a kind of unity to the plays in terms of both the time it takes to put them on and the place where the action occurs. For time, we're not supposed to go beyond 24 hours. That is to say, the action of any given play ought to take place in a period of 24 hours and be in the same location. Lope says, nah, what folks want to see is large-scale spectacle. So it's okay to have a play that goes as far back as creation, and it's okay to have a play that goes as far forward as Last Judgment. Why not? Now, Lope did think, that it was important that you were able to distinguish between higher, middle, and lower class characters when they were on the stage. So he gave them a particular set of speech patterns corresponding to their social position, a kind of high, medium, and low diction. But he says it doesn't matter whether all of these folks are on the same stage at the same time. In other words, he had no particular problem at all about putting kings into comedies and rustic folk into serious plays, into tragedies. Well, let's take a look at the way that theory becomes practice for Lope in what is his best known, or perhaps a little bit more modest claim, most frequently anthologized play. We have to be careful, of course, because when we're pulling one out of 450 or 1500 or 1800, take your choice, it's a little bit dangerous to say any one play is going to be particularly representative, but I think that we can extract some things at any rate that are important for us to come to an understanding not only of who Lope was, but also to an extent why he was considered to be so important in his own time. And might add, so frequently neglected in ours. This is a little anecdote to show that. I was talking about Lope de Vega with a colleague of mine a couple of days ago, just simply saying that I was in the process of preparing a lecture on Lope, and I was sort of talking about the reading I was doing and so on. And he said, Lope de Vega, what century did he live? And thought that the answer was 20th. Now, this colleague, it turns out, distinguished colleague of mine with a PhD from an Ivy League university. Now, granted, his field is American literature. Nonetheless, could not place Lope for sure, okay, in his own time period. And it seems to me that that's representative of the fate that Lope has had in our own time, very rarely put on. And so I guess part of what I want to do is to make a case that he should be put on, and that it would be not wrong to put him on, the folks who, let's say, do Shakespearean drama regularly. I'm thinking, let's say, of the Stratford Festival on either side of the Atlantic, the one that we have in Canada, the one that they have over there, Stratford-on-Avon, I think it's called, that they have for Shakespeare. I think that Lope would do very well, and this might be a play that would make the point as well as any other. Fuente Ovejuna, the sheep well, was probably written between 1612 and 1614. No less a pair than Ferdinand and Isabella show up as characters in the play. From the perspective of the English-speaking world, clearly the most famous monarchs in Spanish history, not only, in fact, do they show up as characters on stage at the end of the play, but they are the characters who turn potential tragedy into comedy to make sure that the ending comes out okay, even though this is a play not without a great many tragic and very serious moments. Yet, despite the presence of Ferdinand and Isabella and several others from high up on the food chain, socially speaking, politically speaking, there's no question, I think, that the main characters in the play are members of the lower class, rustics, peasants really, people who work the land, and that not only are we meant to see things from their perspective to a great extent, but they are seen to be repositories of wisdom. It seems that if you're looking at it in terms of ideas, they are the ones who are much more grounded in reality and without the self-interest that seems to have blinded many of the upper class characters. Fuente Ovejuna has a good plot, another thing that Lope is noted for, that sense that people are going to keep coming back if there's something satisfying about the way all of the parts fit together. And it turns out that it is based on a historical incident. Lope goes into the past. He writes the play, remember, in 1612. He talks about an event that takes place in 1476. What happened was that the peasants of a town, of a community called Fuente Ovejuna, rose up against their feudal overlord. And so by putting Ferdinand and Isabella in the play, they sort of provide a kind of perspective that allows us to see this in terms of some of the larger historical events that are taking place at the time. And one of them is that this feudal overlord, the bad guy in the play, one of the great stage villains of all time, he really turns out to be somebody who has backed another claimant to the Spanish throne. Okay, that this is a point in history, in other words, when Ferdinand and Isabella are trying to kind of consolidate everything, and this feudal overlord, who is the bad guy in Fuente Ovejuna, turns out to be somebody who is backing another horse, the King of Portugal. So you have the fact that the events of the larger world are there as a kind of background in the play, and the plot is sort of all about the reasons why they may well be, why these people had a pretty darn good reason to rebel against this overlord. The plot begins when this part of the plot, at any rate, when the Comendador has made it clear that he is entitled to all of the women in the village. And we see this sort of from the bottom up, which is to say what? Which is to say there is a developing interest here between a peasant and a peasant woman, a love affair between the hero and the heroine of the play, Frondoso, the peasant, Laurencia, his girlfriend. And so what happens is that, among other things, this is kind of in the old course of true love never did run smooth tradition of comedy. What is keeping this relationship from coming together is not the father, in this case, who's very happy that this is happening, but the fact that the commendator wants to have first dibs on her. And he says very explicitly, what's the problem here? And then lists all of the other women in the village that he's had and said, you know, all of these people didn't object. Why should you? Well, in all of this, there are a lot of interesting takes on the nature of love itself. So you have, for example, at one end of the spectrum, at least implicitly, Ferdinand and Isabella as a kind of love match that's going to sort of unite Spain. And then all of the characters within the play have some kind of take on the nature of love itself, not only romantic love, but how romantic love ties in with other obligations, with other duties, and with other conceptions of what love is. Laurencia is, of course, the one that the commendator is especially interested in, precisely because she herself is interested in somebody else. Now, what's sort of interesting is that there are other ways in which the play talks about what a not nice guy the commendator is, a person who sort of gets in his way almost accidentally is given no less than 2,000 lashes for that. He's flogged to the tune of 2,000 lashes. I mean, my sense is that most people wouldn't stay conscious after more than about 5 and wouldn't stay alive for more than 20. He gets 2,000. And he sort of comes back on stage to talk a little bit about it. And even though he talks about it in kind of earthy and realistic ways, it's clear that he was sort of brought almost to the point of death for nothing more than a slight to the commendator. But also, he's one of the characters who, if you were to sort of interview him and say, all right, what's your sense about what love is all about? He would look at the talk itself about love as being sort of meaningless, because his point of view is the following. He says, I state the worth of self-love, native to this earth. That is the love which governs all things. Affinities in great and small things must regulate all that we see. I don't deny that. I agree that everything is truly fond of what to it may correspond in keeping its integrity. My hand against a coming blow leaps up to guard my face, and so my feet, by running off, forestall a danger that might else befall my body. So there's a sense in which at bottom, at root, what it's all about is survival. Now, I state this because it seems to me that it's a position, he says this fairly early on in the play, it's a position that turns out to be refuted in the actual plot, in the actual action of the rest of the play, where folks in the village come together. What happens is that there's a rebellion, but the rebellion is spurred on by the women of the village rather than the men. And particularly effective in this regard is Laurencia's speech. She's been dragged off to the commendatores, okay? And it's sort of interesting that it's never made exactly clear how much he gets and how much he doesn't. She fights back like crazy, but it's not clear whether he has had his way with her or not. And right before her beloved is about to be put to death for defending her, she says, in no uncertain terms, to the people of Fuente Ovejuna that they had better rebel. And it's a really wonderful sort of call to action. Christine de Pizan would have been very proud, I think, of the way in which you see a woman assuming both a martial and heroic stand, calling the wimpy men to action. All right, read a little bit from it, because I think it's kind of a neat set piece in the play. She has come back, okay, from her time at the Commendators, and she says, for many reasons, and of these the weightiest is that you neither rescued me from traitors, nor yet took vengeance on those bestial tyrants whom you let kidnap me. I was not yet Frondozo's, her beloved, her fiancé, so you can't fob off on him the duty of avenging me. How come nobody in the village came to my rescue, is what she's saying. On you the duty lies as well. Until the night when marriage is fulfilled and consummated, it is the father's duty, not the husband's. And then she says, I was taken under your eyes to Fernan Gomez's house, while you looked on like coward shepherds, letting the wolf escape uninjured with the sheep. They set their daggers to my breasts. And we find out a little bit later in the speech that she's not talking metaphorically there, that she really is wounded. And so what she says finally is that we have to kind of just all rise up against this. Well, in point of fact, that's exactly what they do. They revolt. Now, this is sort of tricky business. How do they go about doing this? First of all, of course, when all else fails, make it a question of self-respect. Look at what she finally says to finally get them over the edge. You are not Spaniards, but barbarian slaves. Again, speaking to all the men of Fuente Ovejuna. Yes, you are hens to suffer that your women by brutal force should be enjoyed by others. Put spindles in your belt. Why wear those swords? As God lives now, I shall make sure that women alone redeem our honor from these tyrants and make these traitors bleed. As for you, you chicken-hearted Nancy boys and sissies, spinning wheel gossips and effeminate cowards, we will throw stones at you and have you dressed in petticoats and crinolines and bonnets, with rouge and powder on your pansy faces. Now the Commendator is about to hang Frondozo up alive, to starve and die head downwards from the castle's battlements. Well, what's kind of cool here, of course, is that the men would rather face the Commendator's troops than that kind of abuse. They revolt, and it turns out that they throw him off the battlements instead, and he dies. So there you have it, the revolt itself. But of course, when peasants revolt against their overlords, this is not something that is taken lightly at all. So you have a retribution that is not far, it's not lengthy before it sort of happens, okay? What happens is that it is reported back to the king that there's been this revolt. And so they say, well, we got to find out who did it. Well, nobody's fessing up to it. Well, since they can't find out who did it, we can't punish anybody, but let's try and do it the old-fashioned way to find out who did it. We'll send a judge who's responsible to find out, to make examples of all of the folks who are guilty. And the most convenient way to do this, of course, is to torture everyone until we find somebody who's going to confess and tell us who is responsible. But when they do the torturing, and a lot of this is sort of presented semi-on, semi-off stage, so you probably don't get to see the torturing, although I could see a stage version where you would. What you hear are the cries and the screams of the folks as they are being tortured. And the answer that they all give when they said, who's responsible, who did it, the answer is Fuente Ovejuna did it. Which is to say, of course, that the village takes up a kind of collective responsibility for what they have done. And it's sort of interesting to go back to that original statement, the peasant who says what everything is all about is self-preservation. It turns into the fact that the collective is more important, that dog eat dog gives way to we're all in this together. And so when it's reported back to the king, they can't punish anyone. And it has been said, and I think with a certain amount of justification, that therefore the real hero of the play is the village itself. Whatever truth is in this, it shouldn't obscure the fact that the characters are well drawn and individualized. The discussion of love is very interesting. You have a great story where the good guys win, but without in any way minimizing the tragedy or tyranny or the price of victory. Pain and suffering are presented with directness that is very interesting in connection with all of the broad humor in the play. And it seems to me that with all of that, Lope would fit in very nicely with folks who like Shakespeare, who like Marlowe, and who like their contemporaries.